Now, in our first story, we're going to meet the world's biggest blues fan, I would imagine. And I say that because he gave up a good advertising job in Ohio, transplanted himself to Mississippi, and has put his marketing skills to work promoting the blues.
The very first blues record, the actual real blues album I ever bought, was Muddy Waters' Folk Singer. It had things on it like "My Home is in the Delta," literally singing about here. So it just all kept pushing back to here. In February of 1995, I was recruited for a job in St. Louis, Missouri. So I moved there for the big job, the one you move for. But I get to St. Louis, and being a longtime blues fan, it kind of suddenly occurs to me, wait a second, Mississippi's probably 5 hours away. So I remember when I first visited, my very first visit to Clarksdale, I went out and saw at that time what was left of Muddy Waters' home out at Stovall Plantation. I came down to do what I called the Dead Man Blues Tour. The idea being that I just sort of walk where my heroes walked, walk where the music came from, just assuming that it was probably all gone. So it just became my regular long weekend vacation spot. But I kept visiting here and thinking, well, I should be doing this. This is a place that actually seems like it needs me. I can make a difference versus there, I'm just a cog in the machine. When I made this decision, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to drop out of this ridiculously high-paying job. But you also had to think about, okay, I got to make a living. And I also need a way that I can actually meet people on a regular basis. You don't want to be stuck in some little cubby hole or office or whatever. So I came up with basically the store I always wanted to walk into, but could never find. And certainly Clarksdale did not have, and that's Cathead that we're standing in. Sort of like shopping in a well-lit juke joint. You can have folk art on the walls and blues art on the walls. You can have everything blues related, recordings, documentaries, things to read, t-shirts, of course, all that kind of stuff. But then it becomes this platform to work from so that you can start to book shows or create festivals or make documentaries or whatever. So we started Juke Joint Festival, and it's just built up to this beast. I mean, it really is stressful to even think about as much as I love it. And what that does is it creates business that weekend, but then it has sort of legs to it, where people start thinking about opening a business downtown, or people start thinking about moving here. So people ask all the time about sort of the fate of the blues and the health of the blues, and is it dying? So the genre is healthy. The culture that it came from, particularly in the South, particularly in Mississippi and the Delta, it's getting very, very thin in terms of being able to walk up to an old bluesman in his 80s and say, what was it like? How'd you grow up? There are still guys like a big George Brock. George loves to talk about his mule Ida, who he plowed with a mule. That's, it's not that distant of a past, I guess. And he'd sing to Ida to make her work harder. And he just swears, that mule would work harder if I sang to her. How can you tell that story if not in pictures?
You go to church, I go to two. You go to work, I tell you what I do. You get paid, I hold the money. I be right there, but take you, honey. You go, I'm going with you.
When I started trying to document Big George Brock, basically tried to formulate a comeback for him. Here's an old bluesman who had sort of disappeared into the sands of time, but was totally real deal and still at the top of his game in terms of his performance. And basically ended up with this cool little documentary called Hard Times. That's the first thing that I did for film festivals. Of course, now it's on DVD. After doing Hard Times, we just started talking about doing some bigger project. In fact, we'd call it The Project. So we'd be sitting at, a crazy hill country house party with moonshine and out-of-tune guitars, and something crazy happens and somebody starts a tire fire, and you're like, this is the project. And that's essentially what M for Mississippi is. It's a 7 consecutive day road trip through Mississippi, having those crazy experiences. And we followed that up with We Juke Up in Here, which essentially is a study of, okay, what's a juke joint and where are they now? What happened to them? So our newest project is called Moonshine and Mojo Hands, and we just tour folks around showing them crazy blues experiences, some historical things, and then some things that are just like barbecued raccoon at a blues yard party, that kind of thing. But it's the kind of stuff that, people really, they want that authentic blues experience, and it can still be had in Mississippi if people hurry up and get here. Well, yeah, and then Hidden History of Mississippi Blues. I know the History Press loves it. They'd read about some things I'd done, so they kind of knew about me. They did some research and thought, well, that seems to be the guy. So we want this book on Mississippi blues, but we don't know what we want. What do my customers ask me about the most? So that's kind of how I broke it up. I was like, well, people ask about the origins of the blues, obviously you've got to have, but also things like the crossroads and all the stuff ties into that. Juke joints, what are these things, and etc. So I basically wrote chapters on things people ask me about the most. And then since I'd already been interviewing old bluesmen for the better part of 10 years, at that point for Blues Review magazine, I just took those interviews and re-edited them as chapters. So you have, T. Model Ford, Robert Belfour, these real storied characters that just have amazing backstories. I get customers who ask me, they'll say things like, well, you must really love the blues to have moved here. It's like, well, I do love the blues, and I did move here, but I could have kept visiting here if I was just gonna come down and try to hear stuff. My thing is, I came here for the music, but it's the people that kind of made me want to stay. There's real Southern hospitality here for one thing, but also just all the stories and the characters. It's kind of like this culture with a voice. And I think that's what has just been so attractive to me, to be able to spend time with these guys. Or Robert Bilbo Walker, a guy who's 80 years old and wears a wig and a suit and dances with his guitar. The late T. Model Ford, a bluesman who made it to maybe 93 years old, was in here one day entertaining the ladies as he did. And I said, tell him where you're from, T. Model, because usually he said, I'm from Greenville, Mississippi, and like draws it out. Instead that day, without just, even pausing, he says, I'm from the United States of Mississippi, in that great drawl. But I started thinking about that, and it's like, it really kind of is like that. Within the music and the art and the culture, it's like this little country. Back then, there were the signs when you came into Mississippi. Now it says birthplace of America's music, which is true and which is awesome. But I kind of like the old signs because it said Mississippi feels like coming home. And I'm not a Mississippian. I'm not even from the South, maybe Southern Ohio. But it always felt just like that to me. It felt like I was coming back to I'm supposed to be there. That's home.
Thanks for joining us. If you like what you see, subscribe to Mississippi Public Broadcasting. Till next time, I'll be seeing you on Mississippi Roads.